Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is the Reverend Dr. David D. Grafton, and I'm Professor of Islamic Studies and Christian Muslim Relations and the Director of the Duncan Black Macdonald Center here at Hartford International University. So welcome to this webinar on American Christian nationalism, Christian Zionism, and the Middle East. It should be a very interesting and important webinar, and I'm delighted to have some colleagues and guests with us today. First, a few words about the Macdonald Center. The Macdonald Center is a research center within HIU dedicated to scholarly research, education, publication, and communication in the areas of the study of Islam and Christian-Muslim relations. It provides resources as well as a gathering place for domestic and international students and participants to engage in critical learning, dialogue, and share perspectives on a range of issues related to Islam and Christian-Muslim relations. The Macdonald Center also challenges scholars, students, the media, religious communities, and the public to move beyond general stereotypes and develop an accurate awareness and appreciation of Islam. So welcome to this webinar today. In a recent interview with host Tucker Carlson on June 18th, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas indicated that he supported a war against the Islamic Republic of Iran by Israel and the United States because of his beliefs in the Bible. Another prominent American politician, the ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, texted President Trump, encouraging him to step forward to face the looming decision between Israel and Iran. He reportedly texted this, quote, "No president in my lifetime has been in a position like yours, not since Truman in 1945. I believe you will hear from heaven, and that voice is far more important than mine or anyone else's," end quote. Cruz's comments and Huckabee's text reveal popular American Christian perspectives, and not only evangelical perspectives about the Middle East. So in this webinar, we will examine the perspectives of American Christian nationalism and Christian Zionism, and its views of Islam, Iran, and the modern state of Israel. We'll explore how the Bible is utilized to support political positions in relation to the international politics of the Middle East. And finally, we'll hear an American Jewish and American Iranian response to such political theologies. To get into this, I'm delighted to welcome four guests who will be with us today, four panelists. The first is Joyce C. Chang. She is the postdoctoral research fellow at the Hartford Institute for Religion Research. Her research centers on Asian American congregations, with a special attention on the role of religion in Asian American attitudes and belonging. Additional research topics include racial attitudes, social movements, and the assimilation theory. Originally from California, Joyce is currently completing her PhD from Baylor University. Welcome, Joyce. Our next panelist is Reverend Robert O. Smith, who is Assistant Professor of History at the University of North Texas. Robert is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation and an ordained minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And for full disclosure, I am as well. We are colleagues in that. He earned his PhD from Baylor University and holds an MDiv and MA in Islamic Studies from Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. His path-breaking work on the political ideology of Christian Zionism is exemplified in his books, More Desired Than Our Own Salvation, The Roots of Christian Zionism in 2013, and Comprehending Christian Zionism, Perspectives and Comparison with Goran Gunnar in 2014. Welcome, Robert. Glad you're here. Our next panelist is Benjamin Sachs, who is the head of scholarship and the Jewish scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, Jewish Studies in Baltimore, Maryland. As a part of his role, Ben has discussed his work on PBS and Baltimore's NPR affiliate WYPR. Ben currently serves as the co-chair for the Religion, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies Unit and on the steering committee for the Interreligious and Interfaith Studies Unit of the American Academy of Religion. He is also co-editor of the Journal of Ecumenical Studies and has a forthcoming book in 2026, Is Dialogue Possible? The Israeli-Palestinian Conflict and the Question of Anti-Semitism. Glad you're here, Ben. Welcome. And finally, Professor Hossein Kamali, Professor of Interreligious Studies and holder of the Imam Ali Chair here at HIU. He has a PhD from Columbia University, where he has also worked as the Middle East, Islamic, and Jewish Studies librarian and taught at Columbia and Barnard College. Born in Tehran, there Hossein pursued diverse disciplines of learning, actively participating in formal classes and informal circles on philosophy, epistemology, and traditional Islamic learning. His first book in English, God and Man in Tehran, Contending Visions of the Divine, was published in 2018 by Columbia University Press. And he's currently working on several projects, including a monograph entitled Giving Voice to Scripture, Tafsir in the Imami Shia Tradition. Welcome, Professor Kamali. Glad you're here. Now, thank you for joining me in this panel, and I have some questions for each of you as you present, and then we will, once you all have an opportunity to respond to my question and present, we'll interact with one another. There is no chat on this webinar, so please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. Now, because the Macdonald Center focuses on the study of Islam and Christian-Muslim relations, I'd like to begin with a larger frame here, and that is how many Americans view Islam and Iran as the Islamic Republic. And there have been a number of different studies done on this, all that have showed that Americans continue to have negative views of Islam. And so I'd like to turn to Joyce and have you reflect on this larger frame of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry, recognizing that those are contested terms, and what some of the more recent sociological research shows about how American Christians perceive Islam, Muslims, and how perhaps they are different according to different affiliations, party affiliations. Joyce.
Thanks for having me on this panel, David. It's great to be here. I'd like to begin by saying that most sociological research on Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment often centers on two key ideas, the other and threat. Similar to attitudes towards other racial and religious outgroups in U.S. history, Muslims are constructed as a symbolic threat to the perceived purity and dominance of white Christian America. In other words, anti-Muslim sentiment is deeply rooted in fear. One notable study by Gertes, Hartman, and Edgell identifies three main dimensions of this perceived threat. They look at public safety, morals and values, and tolerance of others. This really contrasts Europe, where anti-Muslim sentiment often focuses on more economic and welfare concerns. The authors argue that Muslims sit at this intersection of these three areas. They're racial others through their appearance, religious others through their beliefs, and civic others through their actions. Although measures of Islamophobia haven't been updated as frequently in recent years from the sociological side, especially after the spike in attention during the Trump era, I have gathered some insights from the Wave 5 of the Baylor Religion Survey, which was conducted in 2017. The survey included a battery of questions about perceived threats from Muslims, Jews, atheists, and conservative Christians, all which are considered religious outgroups, and respondents rated the extent to which each group posed threats to values, personal freedom, and physical safety. I included a little snippet of the survey right here on the side, and for those who are really interested, the full report and graphs are available on the Baylor Religious Survey website. So in this first graph, we see the breakdown of percentages of respondents who agree that this group poses a specific threat to them. Overall, we see that Americans report little sense of threat from Jews, suggesting that anti-Muslim sentiment is not just about religious difference in general, but specific factors tied to Islam. Muslims are perceived as threatening to both freedom and safety, and they compete with atheists as a perceived threat to American values. In the next few slides, we break this down by religious tradition. Although these graphs compare different religious groups, we're going to focus on Muslims, which is the blue bar. So look at the blue color. As we will see, evangelicals stand out as most likely to perceive Muslims as threatening. For example, when it comes to perceived threats on one's values, we see that evangelicals feel the most threatened by atheists, but this is closely followed by Muslims. 44% of evangelicals see Muslims as a threat to American values, and this is more than double of other religious groups. When it comes to perceived threat from limiting one's freedom, evangelicals feel the most threatened by Muslims, with 52.5% of them believing that Muslims are a threat to one's freedom. Catholics come second at 33.6%, but overall we see that all religious groups hover around 20% in perceiving Muslims as a threat to limiting freedom. Lastly, Muslims are also viewed as a top safety threat by evangelicals, then followed by mainline Protestants and Catholics alike, but evangelicals are still 2 times more likely to believe that Muslims are a threat to personal safety. Based on all these graphs, we can see that the pattern is clear. Certain religious groups have a strong symbolic boundary with specific religious outgroups, and specifically we see that with evangelicals and Muslims. Next, we examine perceived outgroup threat by party affiliation, which amplifies these dynamics. Republicans, especially strong Republicans, are far more likely to perceive Muslims as threatening across all 3 domains. So in this first graph, we see 60% of strong Republicans and 42% of moderate Republicans see Muslims as a threat to American values, and that's over 3 times higher than Democrats or independents. When it comes to feeling threatened about limiting one's freedom, again, we see that 68.4% of strong Republicans feel threatened by Muslims and 55.7% of moderate Republicans feel threatened by Muslims. This religious outgroup is the highest for both Republican groups. Lastly, for threats to personal safety, we see relatively low percentages for all party affiliations, except for Muslims, for strong Republicans at 66.7% and moderate Republicans at 42%. For each of these perceived threats, there is a 6 to 16 percentage point difference between Republicans and evangelicals. So perhaps at the end of the day, it's political ideology that's working with religious identity to shape these perceived threats from Muslims, with the strongest effects among white evangelical Christians and Republicans. And so when we're looking at how these attitudes have also changed over the decade, we've seen some upward trends in anti-Muslim sentiment over the past decade, where it's fueled by political rhetoric and global conflicts. Most Americans recognize that Muslims face discrimination, and nearly half of US Muslims report experiencing at least one form of discrimination in the past year as of 2017, the latest survey on anti-Muslim sentiment from Pew Research Survey, and that's an 8% increase from a decade earlier. More recently, a Pew Research survey found that 70% of US Muslims reported increased discrimination amid the Israel-Hamas war, nearly double the rate among US adults overall. This conflict has also taken an emotional toll, with US Muslims reporting much higher levels of fear and exhaustion compared to the general public.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Yeah, that does commensurate with some of the other studies that I've seen from other different groups. In terms of Iran, do you have any perspective on how Iran as the Islamic Republic might be viewed? It's my kind of feeling that Americans have this neuralgia of Iran because of the Iranian Revolution in '79, of course, and then the Iranian hostages. Now, of course, Iranians have a different perspective on American-Iranian relations, and maybe Hossein could speak to that later. But I'm just wondering if there's anything with the Islamic Republic that people have responded to.
So I haven't come across any specific sociological study that explicitly states the religious identity of Iran automatically makes it more threatening to certain religious groups. But what the data consistently shows is that Muslims as a group are widely perceived as threatening in the US and globally. One of my favorite sociology articles by Michelle Christian, for example, theorizes what she calls the world system of global white supremacy. Her theory examines the history of Western colonialism, enslavement, state building, and how that created this racialized global structure and ideologies in which states, economies, and institutions support white dominance, while discourse and culture reinforce it. But put simply, there's just been laws, policies, and practices that perpetuate anti-Muslim sentiment globally, and these also are racialized through how Muslims are marked through their skin tone, their religious clothing, and their cultural difference. And after factoring the discourse and the structures, it's not surprising that American Christians, specifically white Christians, see a Muslim majority state like Iran as more threatening than, say, a secular state, even when geopolitical circumstances are similar. So Islamophobia in the US, I think, is less about theology per se and more about race and power and cultural othering, which is deeply rooted in the global racial hierarchy.
Thank you for that. Professor Kamali, is there anything you want to add on this note here about my question?
Thank you, Reverend Grafton, for having me on this panel and also for your question. If I may, I will take a few minutes to answer your question to the best of my ability. In reference to the theme of this webinar, which is Christian Zionism and nationalism. There's no mistaking it. Christian Zionism occupies a prominent seat at the table of American politics. It's fair to say it has not only found a place at the table, it also helps to set the menu of US Middle East policy. And it has been doing this for decades. Christian Zionist positions on Iran have been consistently alarmist, apocalyptic, and politically hawkish. For example, its influence is plain in the rhetoric of the junior senator from Texas, whom you brought up, Professor Grafton, at the start. As a current member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, especially its subcommittee on the Near East, South Asia, Central Asia, and counterterrorism, and the former member of the Armed Services Committee, that junior senator has consistently pushed for hardline positions on Iran. Last June, as you referenced, in a televised interview, he renewed his call for regime change in Iran. But when asked about the country's population, it became clear he didn't even know its size, let alone the makeup of the population. His confidence was absolute, his knowledge less so. Often wrong, seldom in doubt. The organization known as Christians United for Israel, CUFI, which was founded in 2006 and is now the largest Christian Zionist organization in the United States, at a 2012 summit, the founding pastor delivered a sermon that left little room for ambiguity. I quote, "Just like ancient Persia sought to destroy the Jewish people, modern Persia, Iran, is again threatening Israel with annihilation." End quote. You can hear the echo clearly when the senator declares what the senator declares from the pulpit, from the podium, the pastor has already preached from the pulpit. Christian Zionists portray Iran as a latter-day Haman or as the Gog and Magog of biblical prophecy. And I want to reference Joyce's wonderful presentation and say that this hostility toward Iran is intimately tied to a broader theme, and that is anti-Muslim bigotry. The term Islamophobia, in my view, signals a failure in diagnosis. This isn't a phobia, not like claustrophobia, ophidiophobia, or triskaidekaphobia. I have difficulty pronouncing that word. It's not a fear of tight spaces, snakes, or the number 13. No. As you noted, Professor Grafton, there is a strong statistical correlation between the rise and fall of the so-called Islamophobia and election cycles, for example. At a more fundamental level, this is not about fear, it's about active bigotry, callous dehumanization, and bare-knuckle political machination. It's not merely psychological and subjective, but institutional and objective, from televangelist media to think tanks and unfortunately even some universities. When anti-Iran and anti-Muslim bigotry hides behind scriptures, it bears the same sinister fruit again and again. Just over a month ago, on June 13th, Israel launched a major attack on Iran. 10 days later, the United States joined in, bombing nuclear facilities at Fordow and Natanz. As of June 24th, thanks to the direct intervention of the US president, a ceasefire has been in place. I can only hope that this fragile ceasefire holds and that it opens the door to a genuine and sustainable peace. It breaks my heart not only to see my native country and my birth city ravaged, but to witness human lives lost anywhere. Enough of these perpetual wars, enough of the fantasy of Armageddon. Thank you.
Thanks for those reflections on that. I'm sure we'll come back to more of what you've talked about. So we've talked about Christian Zionism. It's been brought up. And so I'd like to bring Robert in on this, since he's an expert on Christian Zionism. When I saw the interview with Ted Cruz, what struck me is I don't think that his comments are unique in any way. I mean, I think they're quite common held by many people, and so I think this is a good opportunity for us to examine this. I mean, he was not able to respond. It's just like, this is what I learned at church, right? So don't we learn this at church? Mm-hmm. So I think for me, that was like, oh, we really need to talk about this. Is this what people are learning at church? So can you fill us in here, please?
Not at any church I've led, okay. but yes, this is in fact what many people, not just in the United States, are learning at church. Christian Zionism informs what I would call the baseline of evangelical preaching around the world. This is and so as Protestant missionaries spread American style evangelicalism around the planet, they carried this form of theological reflection, which is, of course, as you said earlier, a political theology. It's a theology of colonialism, a theology of a territorial expansion, a theology of settler colonial conquest, and so that that baseline is what Ted Cruz was reflecting in that interview with Tucker Carlson, and yeah, just saying, God will bless those who bless Israel, with a complete misunderstanding, of course, of what that Israel category is in Genesis 12:3, not able to cite Genesis 12:3, but just knowing that this is the general gist of what we ought to be doing as Christians, as faithful, Bible-believing, serious Christians. This is what we ought to be doing. So I grew up in Oklahoma, which is the reddest state in the United States, in the sense that every single county voted for the Republican candidate in the last presidential election. Not even Texas did that. And so that's what I grew up in. And this is the Christianity, in fact, that I grew up in. I became a Lutheran later in life. And so I remember these sermons and my grandparents going on so-called mission trips to Israel and learning this form of Christian Zionism as a part of my childhood. So when I look at Ted Cruz, there but for the grace of the Lutheran Church go I. And but because there is a different form of teaching that our denomination does not follow. The problem is that so many people in liberal denominations like the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, because we're in the general context of the United States, we still parrot and reflect that dominant cultural understanding of what Christianity is. And that's a very problematic thing. If we have a little bit of time, I'd like to take us on a little historical journey and talk about how long-standing these ideas are, because they're not recent. We do talk about the founding of CUFI, the Christians United for Israel, in 2006, but that's not when this stuff started. On 4th of October, 1844, Warder Cresson arrived in Jerusalem as the U.S. Consul General of Syria and Jerusalem, And his chief qualification for the job was his certainty that the second coming was due in 1847. At his interview with the Pasha, Crescent explained that he had arrived for the coming apocalypse and the return of the Jews. U.S. President John Tyler at the time was soon informed by his diplomats that his first Jerusalem consul was a religious maniac and a madman, but Crescent was already in Jerusalem. He eventually changed his name to Michael Boaz Israel, divorced his American Jewish wife, and established a Jewish model farm near Jerusalem. So that's from Jerusalem, the biography. And so 1844, things are already happening. This is long before the establishment of Jewish political Zionism. But we hear those reverberations of those ideas today. Mike Huckabee, who's been brought up, he's currently the U.S. ambassador to the State of Israel. But he said in 2015, there are certain words I refuse to use. There's no such thing as a West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria. There's no such thing as a settlement. They're communities, they're neighborhoods, they're cities. There's no such thing as an occupation. The only occupiers were the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Turks, the Brits, the Romans. They were occupiers. Any Jew is an occupant. So this political implication of a Christian Zionist outlook. And then another person we know, Pete Hegseth, currently the defense secretary, sometimes looks like he's hanging on by the skin of his teeth, but he's still the defense secretary. In 2018, at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, he surprised the people he was talking to by saying, all this has got me thinking about another miracle that I hope all of you don't see too far away, because 1917 was a miracle, 1948 was a miracle, 1967 was a miracle. And there's no reason why the miracle of the reestablishment of the temple on the Temple Mount is not possible. So again, a political manifestation of these belief systems. But I think part of what we run into, a problem of the analysis of Christian Zionism, is that we think about it only as a right-wing Christian problem. And so I like to draw people to statements like this one. I think part of it is that Hamas did not care about a homeland for the Palestinians. They wanted to kill Israelis and make Israel uninhabitable. Well, I got news for them. They were there first. Before the Islamic faith existed, they, Jews, were there in the time of King David, and the southernmost tribes had Judea and Samaria. That's Bill Clinton speaking at Christ Temple Apostolic Faith Church in Michigan, October 30th, 2024, during the Kamala Harris campaign. So this is not somebody we often would peg as a Christian Zionist, but clearly offering a Christian Zionist perspective. And so when I have conversations about Christian Zionism, I like to offer a definition of the term. And the definition that I have tried to work up for a lot of years now, I first published it in 2009, is that Christian Zionism is political action informed by specifically Christian commitments to promote or preserve Jewish control over the geographic area now comprising Israel and Palestine. And that promote or preserve is important because it's Christian Zionism is not a recent thing. In fact, I identified, along with some others, the first example of a political program based on Christian beliefs about Jews and Palestine was in January of 1649. And so this ideology is baked in to Anglo-American identity. It's woven into the foundations of U.S. identity. Cotton Mather and Increase Mather believed these ideas as they were founding the idea of America itself. And so when we look at the ease with which a politician like Ted Cruz rattles this stuff off and the ease with which his constituents simply accept it as true, we need to understand that that's because it's standard, it's normative in the United States. And those of us who would be critiquing this ideology have a much more difficult job to do because we're standing outside that mainstream. And so I think that historical perspectives helps us understand that and the challenge that lies ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that. So many of your comments resonate with me. Of course, you and I are in the same denomination, and other progressive mainline churches face this. The Presbyterians are split over, biblical interpretation, and yeah, I know so many kind of moderate Christians, Protestant Christians, even Catholic Christians, who they certainly would not call themselves Christian Zionists, but in their biblical interpretation, they have a very simplistic, shallow reading of the text that doesn't take into account any kind of historical narrative or thematic narratives that you and I are trained in and look at regularly when we preach. So.
Oh, of course. I mean, just this week, John MacArthur died, and he was a fundamentalist minister in Southern California, and he kind of represents this mainstream fundamentalist understanding in U.S. evangelicalism that that any biblical passage, no matter how difficult, has one interpretation,
Right.
one meaning that is clearly apprehendable through study. And I mean, those of us in other forms of hermeneutical training say, "Oh, heck no, that is not possible whatsoever." And even in honest, like Quranic study, it's like, yes, the text is plain, but it's not simple.
Yeah.
And and I think that anti-intellectualism that's so much baked into what Mark Knoll, the historian, called the scandal of the evangelical mind. All of that contributes to a simplistic view of the world by the people who are wielding the greatest power in the world. And that's a dangerous combination when you have a simplistic, binaristic understanding of truth, and you've got all this power to wield, and you assume you're on the side of the right and the true and the altruistic. And of course that contributes to racist dynamics and ongoing colonial dynamics. All of that's together, and so it's a very dangerous combination.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Your comment about the multiple interpretations uh, prompts me to bring Ben in. I mean, in the Jewish tradition, there's many different interpretations of Torah, 72 for each verse, if I'm not correct. So, I do want to bring Ben in here. You've been doing a lot of work at the center in Baltimore the last couple of years around some of these issues related to Islamophobia, anti-Muslim bigotry, anti-Semitism. And I'd like to hear a little bit from you because, that's become a flashpoint politically. Robert was talking about political perspectives and political platforms. And so, critiquing the U.S. government on what's going on has been viewed as anti-Semitic in many cases, and that's the trend that places are moving. So in your work, I'd love to hear your perspective on this and what you think.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you, Robert, for also drawing attention to the origins of Christian Zionism before the political Zionism in Jewish circles, because that does play a role in our contemporary moment. I'm going to start with an anecdote, a historical anecdote, and then I want to connect it to what the national strategy right now is in combating anti-Semitism and how it's linked intimately to both Islamophobia and a more violent and deleterious policy towards Iran. So Martin Buber, as some of you know, one of the paragons of dialogue, was sitting in his home a few days before the First World War began, and he was visited by William Heckler, a well-known Christian Zionist, but also someone who had done a lot of work combating German anti-Semitism. And in their conversations, Heckler was describing to Buber how excited he was that the end of times was here, that we are going to witness unfathomable, existential, apocalyptic, redemptive violence. And at the same time, Jews will be making their way back to the biblical land of Israel. And that Jews are going to play a part in this violence, and that we should all rejoice that history is finally coming to an end. And Buber seemed less enthusiastic by it through his body language. And Heckler said, but you don't believe in God? And what struck Buber about that reaction was that for Heckler, a belief in God required him to not be an agent, a self, a being that operates in the world, but a figural Jew, a hermeneutical Jew that justifies some of the most insidious violence against Jews, but also against other people as well. And I think that at this current moment, Buber's reticence towards someone who is supporting Zionism and claiming to combat anti-Semitism needs Jews to participate in an eschatological fulfillment of the end of history makes a lot of Jewish people uncomfortable. And so in relation to the other presentations, when we think about the heroes in Jewish biblical texts, the Jewish person who saved us, as it were, from the quote evil Persians was Esther. And in the Conservative Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, there is a national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. And guess its name? Project Esther. And so what we find in this document is that Islamophobia is going to drive the strategy to combat anti-Semitism. So again, Jews no longer having agency in this. The document was drafted by 3 Christian Zionists. They included a Jewish author very later. Very few Jewish organizations have signed on to the project. We learned that anti-Semitism is no longer about ideology, politics, but it's exclusively about anti-Americanism and terrorism. And what's even more distressing is that it has very little to do with Jewish safety. And as I might argue later, it's probably intent to divide Jewish communities. And so last month, the New York Times reported that the Trump administration has already acted on more than half of Project Esther's proposals. So I went onto the website of Project Esther, and I just want to read to you their executive summary. It will only take a minute, and then I want to spend the rest of the few minutes unpacking this so that you can see what the national strategy is. Quote, America's virulently anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-American pro-Palestinian movement is part of a global Hamas support network that is trying to compel the United States government to abandon its longstanding support for Israel. Supported by activists and funders dedicated to the destruction of capitalism and democracy, the Hamas support network benefits from the support and training of America's overseas enemies and seeks to achieve its goals by taking advantage of our open society, corrupting our education system, leveraging the American media, co-opting the federal government, and relying on the American Jewish community's complacency. The National Task Force to Combat Anti-Semitism intends to enlist all willing and able partners in a coordinated effort to combat the scourge of anti-Semitism in the United States. So just in this paragraph, we see that the strategy is to link anti-Semitism with 3 movements: anti-Zionism, anti-Americanism, and solidarity with Palestinian liberation. Anti-Semitism for this document is really part of a global Hamas support network and strategy that works with progressives to dismantle both the United States and the state of Israel. It's suggesting that to be anti-Semitic is part of a civilizational battle against democracy and an open, free society. So it's a national security threat. And so the goal is to make supporting Palestinian liberation not only anti-Semitic, but also akin to supporting terrorism, which then makes it no longer a free speech issue, but one of criminal law. So one goal of this initiative is to expose and eradicate this global network, which has taken over universities, the media, the federal bureaucracy, or so-called deep state, which takes advantage of both democracy and Jewish complacency in this project. I should pause and say that in many ways, this sounds like the classical Jewish conspiracy trope of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Because if we replace this global Hamas support network with Jews, all of a sudden, Jews are taking over universities, Jews take over the media, Jews take over the deep state, Jews take advantage of democracy and Christian complacency in order to undermine our culture. So it's very strange that we're going to combat anti-Semitism with anti-Semitic rhetoric. In addition, the network has 8 masterminds, including 3 prominent Jews, George Soros, Alex Soros, and J.P. Pritzker. And they argue it's created an anti-Semitic ecosystem that includes Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. But the document itself says at the center of this global initiative, people like Soros and Pritzker are intent to destroy Israel and the United States. And so this connection between Israel and the United States, as these paragons of freedom and democracy, are at the core of this critique. And if you want to see how it plays out in a visceral way, I don't want to encourage, I would encourage you, although I don't recommend it as a place, to visit the Bible Museum in Washington, D.C., because you see how these narratives play out in certain ways. I'll end by saying that this is very confusing for many Jews in Jewish communities, because there is a problem of anti-Semitism. We do want to combat anti-Semitism. But when you look at, for instance, the murders at the Jewish Capitol Museum and the attacks in Boulder, according to this document, and the people that are advocating for this document, what motivated both shooters is they were preventing a genocide in Gaza, and that they screamed free Palestine as they did it. And so if the attack itself is anti-Semitic, then the accusation of genocide in Gaza and the slogan free Palestine are also anti-Semitic. But if they are perceived as anti-Semitic, they are a call for terrorism, which means that calls for free Palestine and accusations of genocide in Gaza become illegal. They become subject to the law, which is why we are seeing this concerted effort to force people out of the country, to arrest them, to make their lives very miserable, because anti-Semitism now is linked to this move. But yet, on the other hand, the Tree of Life murders operated based on all the classical anti-Semitic tropes and operate on the same civilizational arguments. And they're not seen as anywhere near as important. And so I think the motivating factor here is a robust Islamophobia that neither makes Jews safe, but then in some way, to combat anti-Semitism means you have to be complicit with Islamophobia.
Thank you, Ben. Boy, I'm assuming some of this will be coming out in your book in next year. I hope you reflect on that. I would like to bring all of the panelists on now. I do want to first go to Professor Kamali, if I could. I want to reflect a little bit. We have a question that has popped up, and I want to reflect a little bit. We've talked about American nationalism and the role of protecting America and anti-Americanism. And I want to reflect a little bit about the Islamic Republic of Iran and its title, so there would be some American Christians who would say, well, of course, we're defending ourselves against the Islamic Republic of Iran because that's what they call themselves. And they have a religious ideology themselves. So I just wonder if you have some responses to that. Earlier, you had made the clear statement that you lament any deaths that happened in the war that happened, and I know you say that regularly. But anyway, I wonder if you have a response to my question about that, about the Islamic Republic.
So yes, there is an Islamic Republic of Iran. There is an Islamic Republic of Pakistan. There is an Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. And there is an Islamic Republic of Mauritania. The Islamic Republic in Iran was established in 1979. The first Islamic Republic in Pakistan, by that name, was established in 1956. And in Afghanistan, the official name kind of took shape after U.S. invasion from between 2004 and 2021. And then later on, it became It was no longer called the Islamic Republic, but Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan as of 1921. And the Islamic Republic of Mauritania has been there since 1958. The name itself, what I'm trying to get at by giving these examples, is that the name itself is not the reason. Of course, there is, in the ethos of the Islamic Revolution of 1979, one could say that there is a strong opposition to the occupation of Palestine, expressed and intended, and that was part of the perceived goal of the revolution, to combat tyranny, as it is put in the Constitution. And therefore, again, addressing one of the questions, there was a military group organized to do so. However, rhetoric in and of itself is not reason for military action. I would suggest that. What Pastor Hagee says, for example, or what may be found in the Schofield Bible of the early 1900s, in and of itself does not in any way justify anti-Semitism. There are anti-Semites who take those texts and act accordingly. Text itself is nothing without interpretation. This is, of course, in direct opposition to literalism that was also criticized by Reverend Smith. Literalism is a lie, whether it is Muslim Salafis who claim it, or the Karaites of the 10th century, or the latter-day evangelists of the United States, or any of the others in the long human history. Literalism is a lie. It simply masks present-day interests and agendas. So when evangelical groups sometimes, or this term we use here today, Christian Zionists, talk about the end is nigh, the end is at hand. I just saw this phrase in an article I was reading a couple of nights ago in Foreign Affairs about post-Iran Middle East. Now it's a jingoistic, somewhat propagandistic article, but then right there in the middle, there is this subheading in bold letters: the end is nigh. Now the biblical illusion is clear, let's say to the book of Revelation, or to similar passages in the New Testament or the Old Testament. And the point is, apocalypticism is a big part of scriptural narrative, whether it is the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Bible or the Quran. My argument, my point, the point I'm trying to make is not to deny this, but to say that there are appropriations, misappropriations of the apocalyptic narrative to project the past onto the future for the purposes of the present. Right? So this talk about, okay, where was Palestine? Palestine didn't exist. Palestinians didn't exist. Many people have come up and said this, which is, of course, an expression of a political position and not so much a historical point. It's not an accurate statement at all. It's not an accurate historical question. This is where I leave it. I have some more comments, but I won't put them through. I look forward to having a conversation.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for that. I want to get back to Robert. Robert, in terms of the biblical interpretation of Esther, I know that you have a comment on that. So that Ben brought up. Sure.
Well, not so much the biblical, but the hyper political, and this. I think to preface my comments, say that Christian Zionism has always envisioned Jews as objects, pawns within a Christian project, and that objectification of, think about this in quotes, the Jew, right? Which is an abstracted reality, not Jews in flesh and blood reality, not concerned about actual Jewish survivance, but the Jew within the Christian imagination, especially the Christian literary imagination. From its inception in the 17th century, Christian Zionism assumes a world in which Jews and faithful Protestant Christians are allies against the enemies of the Pope and the Turk, so Catholicism and Islam at the time. And the Project Esther, then to jump forward, is a product of the Heritage Foundation. And this brings our conversation almost full circle, because Heritage's founders in 1973 were Edwin Fuellner and Paul Weyrich. Paul Weyrich was a conservative Catholic from Wisconsin, who's the mastermind of the U.S. right-wing think tank system. With Jerry Falwell, Weyrich founded the Moral Majority in 1979. For the Reagan administration, Heritage produced the first mandate for leadership, the Conservative Promise. Project 2025, which I think we would all understand as a Christian nationalist project, is produced by Heritage Foundation. That is the 9th iteration of that same Mandate for Leadership series. Project Esther is, therefore, a Christian nationalist, Christian Zionist program par excellence. It brings those two strands together in a programmatic form. Jews have raised their voice of concern in an explicit way to say that the concern of combating anti-Semitism must not be used to promote illiberalism within American society. That was a statement produced or issued by the JCPA on April 15th of this year. And so Jews have been speaking out saying, please stop using us for this illiberal Christian Zionist, Christian nationalist project. But the Christian Zionist project barrels forward. And the reality is that Christian Zionism has always existed comfortably alongside anti-Semitism, but it's precisely because of that foundation of constructing Jews as useful tools for Christian purposes. By the way, my partner and I just finished drafting a book on critical race theory and the New Right. And because the attack on CRT that became public in 2020 is actually the result of these same right-wing think tank structures that had first began combating critical race theory in 2018 through the Southern Baptist Convention, and that jumped through the Council for National Policy, also founded by Paul Weyrich, into the broader right-wing ecosystem in 2020. So all these things are very much tied together, and this effort to supposedly combat anti-Semitism is really nothing more than a Christian nationalist ploy for hegemony.
Yeah, I've always found it ironic, at least among the, when I'm in congregations, mainline congregations, and the conversations about the Middle East and Islam and the state of Israel and Palestine. It's interesting to me that most mainline and progressive Christians try to look at things through a human rights lens, right? Like a modern human rights lens. So what's going on? Is this right? Is it wrong? And some of them are deeply engaged in Jewish-Christian dialogue, right? So they're involved in Jewish-Christian dialogue, but they want to engage this on a human rights perspective. So they may be critical of what's going on politically, but they accept Judaism and Jews in their own right, right? Whereas Christian Zionists, as you said, it's part of a Christian project. They fit into Christian theology, and yet they are supportive of the political situation. So I don't know if Ben has a comment of that.
Comment on which part?
Or experience of, I mean, you deal with, when you work with mainline churches, I'm sure evangelical churches, and the different perspectives that these Christians bring to the table.
Well, I think part of the issue too is that there are way too many Christian perspectives for a Jewish person to grapple with. The word one Protestant that becomes the boogeyman for all the ills of society. For years, I've never been able to get someone to actually tell me what that Protestantism is in a way that goes across the board, because Protestantism are the mainline churches and the evangelical churches and the apostolic churches, and like so. For like a pisha like me, right, who's just dealing with my own commentaries, you add all of this other stuff and it makes it more complicated. The thing is that the sort of red thread among all of these is that it seems like Jews are essential to Christian theology. And that for a Jewish person is just odd in the 21st century. When you were debating in the Middle Ages over they didn't use the term supersessionism, but when you were debating for your theological self-determination, you had a deeper sense of what the challenges that Christianity offered you, the immutable truth of history and Christian hegemony. But in the 21st century in the US, we have liberal and conservative and Catholic, evangelical, Orthodox. That the one thing I can say about all these churches is you need Jews. And so I think that when we have religions that are intimately part of a narrative in which those religions are replacing a previous one, it's inevitable that the living people who embody the tradition that's no longer relevant become expendable, become subject to violence. And whether or not we can deal with that in a positive way remains to be seen. But it's not just a theological issue, right? It's a secular issue too. Very easy to dismiss people by saying that's an old way of thinking, right? You're going back to the 20th century. That means you as a person no longer have values relevant to this moment. And therefore, I don't have to be in dialogue with you. No, I no longer have to take you seriously. And so Jews always have to live in this perpetual tension in relation with Christians, because on the one hand, Christians say really interesting things and have very interesting and important politics that ensure our safety. And yet the complete opposite is true. And we don't always have the tools to navigate which Christian community we're operating with.
Yeah,
the one final example I'll say with that is that when you talk about the politics regarding the Israelis and the Palestinians, there are a lot of liberal-oriented Jews who are appalled by what's happening in Gaza, and yet it's hard for them to decipher the intentions of the critics, fairly or unfairly. I'm not one of those people. I am fully content with my criticisms and my solidarity with Christians and Muslims and Jews on this. But I think for most of my my co-religionists, it's just really hard to figure out who's going to be in solidarity with me as an independent thinking person with values that's relevant. Feelings too.
Thank you. Joyce, you wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, I think in listening to all this, I think one of the things I also wanted to reemphasize is this idea of the other, right? Like there is this major othering going on, but also in research of white Christian nationalism, a lot of it is violent. And I think that's where war and discussions of discrimination comes in. And that's been what has been really interesting to me to see, like someone listening to biblical theology of peace and wanting to build just relations, but there's this very violent nature of this Christian nationalism that's being perpetuated, and that is justified because they want to prevent the other from threatening them. And so they're defending their grounds, they're defending their people, they're defending their values, or whatever they want to think. That is how they want to go about it. It's quite violent and establishing moral order, and that's how they want to do it. So in combination of talking about Islamophobia and the war, that is, I think, another layer of what is going on in their thinking, not just that they want to fight for their beliefs, but that violence is the answer.
Yeah, thanks. It's a broad issue. There is a question that I want to ask and respond to, which is along the lines of her interpretation or violent interpretation. There's often an assumption that the Quran is a violent text because Muslims have to read it literally as the literal words of God. There's only one interpretation of that. Of course, we know that's not true. That overrides the long history of variety of different kinds of Islamic tafsir and interpretation. But I think the question that is asked about the violent nature of the Quran here reflects similarly the comments that Senator Ted Cruz made, in that there's this perception, but I don't know why. I can't back it up. But all I know is that I've read the Quran is violent. So, Professor Kamal, you and I teach together. We teach biblical and Quranic interpretation. So I wonder if you want to just say a word about that.
By all means. Professor Grafton, is there time for me to just add a little remark about the conversation that's going on? Very, very helpful, very enlightening conversation. The idea that the politically motivated interpretations of Christian Zionists are often ahistorical, theologically abusive, racializing, othering, as Joyce was saying, Dr. Kang was saying, and more often than not, they are anti-Semitic. I want to see if my colleagues would agree with this. Christian Zionism in spirit is anti-Semitic, partly because, as it was mentioned, it looks at the Jew as an instrument. It instrumentalizes Jewish heritage and Jewish identity. It does the same with Muslims. So there is a twofold bifurcating essentialization, othering going on. One is the useful tool that is going to bring about the Armageddon, and some of the tools of the people will be saved. But then there are the villains involved, right? The celebration of mass destruction. That is also there. This is why I propose that instead of Islamophobia, we call it what it is, which is anti-Muslim bigotry, institutional bigotry. Institutional, it's sociological, it's not psychological. We need to highlight that and drop the word Islamophobia, which is a soft word. Oh, I'm scared of snakes. I'm scared of Muslims, so I avoid them. No, this is systematic annihilation of people by drawing on biblical passages. Remember what the Amaleks did to you. And the Palestinian six-year-olds are the Amalek. No, I think this is a travesty. This is not hermeneutics, right? In the same way, to answer the question, as I suggested this in my earlier presentation, literalism is a lie. Literalist hermeneutics is a lie. Whoever tells you any text, let alone scripture, is plain and simple for every idiot to read and understand. They are violating thousands of years of tradition, whether it is Jewish tradition, Islamic tradition, Christian tradition, Hindu tradition, Buddhist tradition. It's a lie. So, period. I hope that question does not come up. This is not the first time I'm getting the exact same question from the exact same person. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. Any other comments you might want to make about one another's comments? I do see a question here that related to activism and religious activism. So in Christian Zionism, as several of you alluded, this is a This is a political platform that calls for action. And part of the bringing about the end times, or at least a different reign or a different rule, is about participating in this. Can you all comment on that? I mean, it's not new. You know, there have been Jewish, Christian, Muslim groups throughout history that have seen themselves as playing a part in whatever, bringing about a kingdom, bringing about a just rule, or whatever, righteously, through violent means, you know, through undertaking using the sword.
So if I could jump in here, David, so earlier this year, in late January, I was pleased to help plan and implement the first international consultation on Christian Zionism that was hosted by Prince Ghazi, His Royal Highness Prince Ghazi of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And so this gathering took place on the Dead Sea, near the baptismal site of Jesus on the Jordanian side of the river. And it was a wonderful experience. But as part of the planning team for that, I was the only non-Arab in that conversation, and it was of course, with our Jordanian Muslim friends and Palestinian Christian friends at the table. It was a profound experience that went over those conversations. That small group went over a lot of what we're discussing here today. Part of the challenge that I heard from Muslim colleagues in that space was, you've been telling us for decades that we need to address Islamist extremism in our context. And darn it, we've done a very good job of that. We've done a very public job of that at great risk to ourselves. When will you turn the same lens on the extremism within your own community? And I think that's a challenge, of course, to Christians, which is a very, as Dr. Sachs said, a very complex and overwhelming category that my Muslim dialogue partners in that space also said. It's like, what is Christian? We don't know. It's such a complicated and almost empty category because it's filled with so much contradictory complexity. And the question for Christians, and I think also for Jews, that from these Muslims is, when will you begin addressing the political extremisms within your own communities, these totalitarian claims and totalitarian politics that emerge from your communities, which are deeply violent, as Dr. Chang said. So this is the sort of dynamic that gets us down to the practicalities, I think, of what this conversation is really about. It's not just ideas, it's how those ideas are implemented with multi-ton bombs. It's how these ideas are implemented through failed diplomatic relations, through the religious presuppositions that liberal secular scholars are unwilling to comprehend. All of these things together, where this conversation says, y'all, we need to take these religious dynamics seriously alongside the other analytical forms that inform foreign policy debate. So there's a crisis here, and it is a crisis of extremism, but in the end, it's one that we must all confront within our own communities, just as my Hashemite dialogue partner said, we have done. Now it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you for that. Your comments about Jordan and the crown prince reminds me, one of the great tragedies of the war, of the bombing of Iran, of Tehran, was a colleague of mine had spent 2 years arranging a gathering and a conference of directors from Centers for the Study of Christian-Muslim Relations from all around the world, primarily Africa, Asia, Central Asia, and they were all gathering in Amman the week before everything broke out, and they had to cancel this conference. It took 2 years to put it together, and that conference was to bring people together to begin talking about Christian-Muslim relations around the world, and the tragedy of it, and the Crown Prince was sponsoring it, right? Helping to pay for it. And the tragedy of it was because of the bombings, it was canceled. So the people who are doing good work were shut out of doing good work because of this. Yeah.
That's amazing. And I think and again, for all these American questions we get all the time, it's like, well, why aren't they addressing these problems in their own communities? Well, my friend, they are. And they're publishing report after report, but you're not hearing about it because our culture influences our media, influences what's reported, and that news does not trickle down to you because other people have decided it's not worth you hearing.
Mm.
And I'm not being conspiratorial about that. I think it's a broad cultural set of structures that filter out what's going to be relevant on the 5 o'clock news. And so these biases then remain unchecked alongside conspiratorial theories about Jews in society. And so it's like, well, these things aren't based on any reality, but they're, again, deeply baked in to the structures of our society.
We're nearing the end of our time, and I want to use that to go back to Joyce, to her comments about othering and nationalism. And Joyce, you do so much of your work on these kinds of things. I wonder if you have any kind of final comments about these matters of othering and how easy it is in our society.
Yeah, I really like what Dr. Smith has been saying with the idea of structures and institutions, because they really do work hand in hand with ideologies, right? These conversations that we have with our people, the research that we do, like, we have to understand that those are shaping our thoughts, and those are really, really powerful and really, really invisible. So it's really hard to combat those. But then we see policy forming structures and shaping our economy and the state actors, and we see that's more public, and we want to be able to fight those, but it really does start with conversations on the ground and like personal research and meeting people who have different understandings and not following the literalism and stuff like that. So I think the othering is something that is kind of just something that's easy to hold on to, just to see how human nature reacts to others, right? Like, anyone that's different creates fear automatically. That's like pretty proven in social psychology, and understanding how we understand people, right? Like, there's always this desire for power, and desire for worth and value. And so that makes it really easy to just other someone, right? Like, we do this to animals, even like how we treat pets around us because they're not human and stuff like that. But this has gone beyond that in how we relate to other people in our communities who are different. And we tend to just isolate ourselves into these echo chambers, and we don't realize that that is what is being reinforced and baked into our structures. And it's the people that we end up electing and deciding to hold up. And then we listen, and then they have power, right? Like, the binary thinking and are held by the most powerful, right? Like, we can change that as people, but it starts with not othering, or at least acknowledging that this othering is what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. That's a great way to end this. And HIU is all about that. We're trying to bring people together to combat othering in whatever shape or form it is. I want to thank all of you for coming. Ben Sachs, thank you so much for making the time. Robert Smith, Joyce Chang, Hossein Kamali, thank you very much. And I also want to give a shout out to Joe Chung, who has been in the background here, our tech person for HIU. Joe, thank you very much. We couldn't do this without you. Thank you, everybody, for attending this. This is recorded and will be up on the website. We wish you all a good day. Take care. God bless.